Hey everyone, and welcome back to one of the most anticipated chess matchups in the chess world recently, and that is Magnus Carlsen, the current world number one, versus Gukesh Domaraju, the current world classical chess champion. And now this is a classical game between Magnus and Gukesh, so it's not a rapid game, it's not a blitz game, and it's also normal chess, not freestyle. So this is what we've been waiting for, and let's get to the game. So the opening starts out as the Jobava London. Basically, Magnus tried to surprise Gukesh, and Gukesh opts for c5. And this is an option against the Jobava London where you're immediately trying to take advantage of the d4 and b2 pawn, as the knight just developed to c3. So white kind of can't build that pawn structure. And basically, moves like queen b6 are perhaps going to come in the future. And here Magnus plays e3, and then Gukesh opts for this other move, bishop g4, basically developing his light squared bishop with tempo and asking white a question. And it's basically whether white wants to push f3 and basically weaken his kingside pawn structure a bit, but will play more ambitiously, will try to expand later on towards the game, or will he play a move like bishop e2 and just maintain a solid position. And that is what Magnus does. He decides to play bishop e2, and as you see, there's a trade in light squared bishops, and instead of taking with his other knight or taking back with his queen, he takes with his c3 knight, basically moving the same knight twice. But the idea here is that he wants to play c3 and he wants to solidify his pawn structure. So as I mentioned before, when black played c5 in the opening, it's the idea to basically take advantage of the d4 and b2 pawn, as the knight is on c3. So now once Magnus takes back with the c knight, he frees up that square basically for his c3 pawn. So now his queenside pawn structure is going to be solid again. And as we've seen in the next few moves, he plays c3, he solidifies his pawn structure, and not to mention this knight on e2 will next move go to g3, and basically he's placed his knights on more optimal squares, as the knight on c3 wouldn't have done much anyway. And now it's in this position, Magnus goes to the confession booth. If you don't know what that is, it's basically a place where players can go and share their thoughts during the live game. And Magnus basically said he tried surprising Gukesh in the opening with Jobava, but Gukesh also kind of surprised him back by playing bishop g4 before taking on d4. So if you go back here, what Magnus was expecting was Gukesh takes on d4 and then perhaps plays bishop g4, but that's not what happened. But Gukesh immediately played bishop g4 and didn't trade in the center, and Magnus said he didn't have much clue in what to do in those types of positions. And he basically said, right as the position looks as of now, that it's looking a bit dull. He wants to make a game of it, but really it's just not that exciting. And then he goes back, and okay, look, going back to the game, black castles here, and here he plays queen e2. And now one concept that I'd like to show here is called dynamic play. And here, instead of just castling, Magnus decides to play queen e2 because he still wants to keep his opponent guessing. Or is white going to castle like kingside or queenside? And of course, in this position specifically, queenside wouldn't make too much sense because black would be quick to try and target the queenside, and meanwhile the kingside is pretty safe for black. So queenside castling doesn't make much sense here, but still Magnus plays queen e2 and he still keeps black guessing, like, oh, maybe queenside castling could be possible, you know. And more importantly, he's also just developing his queen to a more active square. And after h6, just creating breathing room for his king, kind of a waiting move by Gukesh, Magnus now plays rook d1. So he shows that he's not going to be castling queenside, but now he brings in his rook, he aligns it with the queen, and now the pawn tensions do get a bit spicy in the center because perhaps ideas of taking and then maybe like trying to pawn break, taking advantage of this queen, you have to check those moves. And here Gukesh spends some time and he decides to move his queen out of the way, targeting the a pawn. And after a3, he brings his rook over as well, basically trying to gain control back in the center files. And here Magnus plays h4, and now this is a common kind of idea in the London and Jobava London, where you try to gain some space on the king side with moves like h4 usually, and that's a fine idea, and it's not like you're weakening your king side pawn structure or anything. And here Gukesh plays queen a4, and the idea is pretty simple. He's looking at the weak light squares and he's also looking at the pawn tensions. He's basically trying to gain more control over squares. Like if you see the queen here it's just tearing into this pawn structure, which is not like targetable at the moment. So he shifts his focus onto the other light squares instead of the dark squares. And here Magnus continues playing knight e5, further activating his knight into the center. And here Gukesh decides to trade knights, and Magnus again is posed with an interesting option. And here he can take with the pawn or the bishop. In the game, he takes with the bishop, the much more solid move and honestly the better move. And looking back, pawn takes is kind of interesting, and it's basically where he forces the knight to go back to d7, and he's basically looking for potentially some sort of kingside attack because the pawn is nicely placed on e5. It removes the f6 knight defender, and here maybe perhaps rook lifting in the future or creating some sort of attack is open. But again, it is risky because you do end up damaging your pawn structure, and in the long term it could be a weakness, and more specifically in this case you don't see a clear attack here for white, so that's why it's a riskier option. Magnus, understandably so, goes for the more normal approach, takes with the bishop. Once the knight goes back hitting the bishop, he decides to drop back because he doesn't want to damage his pawn structure if the knight takes his bishop. So now here Gukesh goes back to a6, and the idea here is pretty simple. He wants to trade queens, and again, if you leave Magnus with a couple of moves, he will still try to create a kingside attack. Of course, as I mentioned before, taking back with the pawn perhaps would have allowed that easier, but it is a bit more riskier. And in this case, still white can try to create a kingside attack. So Gukesh decides to offer a trade of queens and go into a position where he tries to attack on the queenside, or a better word choice would be try to put pressure on the queenside, as if white decides to trade, black takes back, and yes, he does damage his queenside pawn structures, but he also potentially opens up the fouls for his rooks. Not right now because white's dark squared bishop is tearing down pretty nicely, but in the future perhaps the rooks can try to infiltrate and hit the base of the queenside pawn structure, and basically black is getting play on the queenside, and it's basically black who's also just trying to pressure and push forward in the position, and white really doesn't have too much. So going back, Magnus opts for now a more riskier option. He keeps queens on boards and he allows black to gain access on the light squares, especially near his king, but Magnus just decides to keep queens on board, try to push for perhaps a kingside attack in the future. And here Gukesh doesn't play the most accurate per se. He decides to trade dark squared bishops, and now white's dark squared bishop wasn't too powerful per se, so maybe he could have gone for other moves which would give him better chances to try and make the position more spicy, but he decides to just opt for dark squared bishop trade. And after the trade here, it's actually Magnus who's now kind of continuing with his plan, and in this position Gukesh actually has like only one or two moves to not be worse, and that is e5, which he does find. And the reason why I said that is because Magnus has a clear plan of rook h3, rook g3, and basically he's trying to create some sort of kingside attack where it would get deadly if the rook does come here. So at this point, it's making sure that Magnus doesn't have too much time to just continue out his plan. Black has to respond back, and here e5, sacrificing pawn, is a correct way because he's basically going to open up his queen to swing over to the other side, and Gukesh should be able to defend in time. And now, yes, of course, he does sacrifice the pawn, and if Magnus does take, which doesn't happen in the game surprisingly, Gukesh swings over with his queen, and here it looks like the d5 pawn is hanging for black, but it can't really be taken because then the queen comes to b1 and checks, or it can take on g2 first actually in this specific position. So perhaps in this position, let's say white defends the position, defends with a move like perhaps not castling because he wants to continue the attack, but let's say a move like g4 actually. So let's say he plays g4, he protects his knight on h5. Castling would also just hang the knight. So first he plays g4, he protects his g pawn, he protects his knight, so this d5 pawn isn't capturable immediately anyway. And let's say now black plays a move like rook e8, trying to put pressure on white, and now let's say white takes on d5. that isn't quite possible because first black will take back on e5 again as the rook just moved to e8, and now if white tries to take on e5, the queen now comes in and checks. So what I was trying to show is basically the queen on g6 is well placed to also kind of create some counterplay. So the position does get a bit messy, and that's why I suppose Magnus decided not to capture the pawn but instead goes back, threatens mate in 1, and Gukesh here simply defends in the same way. And after a simple trade, Magnus goes back, and position does look a bit more dry now, and as the dust settles, the queens get traded off, but it's still not quite over as after the trade here, Magnus takes back with the c-pawn, and the idea here is Gukesh, if he takes again, Magnus takes back with the rook, and now he has isolated pawn to target in the center, and that should give him something to play towards. So instead of that, Gukesh pushes, and again that leaves another backwards pawn, and that allows Magnus to target it again. So now Magnus reroutes his knight back to c3, as you see, and he basically starts targeting Gukesh's queenside pawn structure. And after a bit of shuffling, he goes rook b1. He wants to play a move like b3, try to chip away at the queenside structure. And after a few moves, first he throws in f3 again, restricting the f6 knight. So here you see it's both sides are trying to set up their pieces back to optimal squares, trying to restrict each other pieces, and basically trying to find ways to target each other's pawn structures. So Gukesh meanwhile has been developing his knight, bringing his rooks to better squares, and after a5 here Magnus pushes with b4, and basically after a trade of couple pieces, Gukesh continues to push forward, and after a trade he goes Magnus goes back here, and he basically keeps an eye on the passed pawn, and this could basically be an advantage and a weakness at the same time because it is a passed pawn all the way on the other side of the board, and Gukesh could try to sneak it through, but right now Magnus does have an eye on the pawn, and this pawn isn't going anywhere anytime soon. In fact, after a couple of moves where Gukesh tries to get into Magnus's position, Magnus does win the passed pawn here, but Gukesh does manage to get his rook in. So right now it's basically a position where both sides are slowly trying to improve, giving some stuff up but gaining some stuff. So here Magnus does lose his g2 pawn, but he does ensure that the passed pawn doesn't become a nuisance, and this also allows his rook to infiltrate further into the position in the future. And here after a couple of moves, Magnus doubles his rooks, he tries to swing in. Gukesh on the other hand trades a couple of kingside pawns, and again he creates another passed pawn on the other side of the board. So it's both sides trying to create some sort of chances, and here Magnus decides to trade a pair of rooks and basically now try to create his own passed pawn in the center. And after a trade, now it's basically Magnus has two passed pawns in the center, Gukesh has two passed pawns on the king side, and now it's some sort of race here. And here Gukesh can actually play h3, and he sacrifices his kingside knight, and after takes it, the idea is he's going to be queening basically. And here now per se, Magnus had to be a bit careful, like he couldn't play any move like king e4 because then he would basically be losing his rook. Whoops, sorry about that. If I go back to the position. So as I said, Magnus had to be careful when Gukesh was queening, and Magnus simply goes back to d2, and here Gukesh queens with queen h1, and Magnus also queens. And now in this position, Gukesh has to be careful because both sides do queen, but right now Magnus is up a knight, and more importantly Magnus is also really close to basically giving a check, forcing the black king out, and creating some sort of problems for the black king which is going out into the open. So Gukesh here had to give a check like rook g2, and after the king goes to d3, basically rook g3, and basically repeat and call it a day and take a draw. But he plays the wrong move. He plays queen h6, and this is actually a blunder very late into the game. And so far throughout the whole game he's been defending nicely, he's been playing nicely, and honestly he didn't even have to sacrifice his knight. He could have gotten a draw a couple of other ways, but he decides to play a bit more sharp, allow queens for both sides, but he had to play accurately, and queen h6 check basically allows Magnus to escape this way. Rook g2, as I mentioned before, would have cut the king off the whole file, and there basically would have been shuffling back and forth, but queen h6 this way allows Magnus to escape, and after a couple of checks, Gukesh here has no other good checks this way, and after he wins back the knight, it's a bit too late because the black king now gets hunted into the open, and here the black king has no way to escape, and a couple of moves later black actually resigns because he's either getting checkmated or losing a bunch of material, and actually he resigns in this position, and yeah, where the king went, he would have ended up losing material or getting checkmated. So crazy turn of events, and honestly both sides have been putting forth a tough fight where Magnus was trying to create chances on the king side, trying to get some sort of attack. Meanwhile, Gukesh on the queen side, shuffling with his queen, trying to find ways to infiltrate. And in the end, they did end up trading queens, and they ended up with an endgame where both were trying to slowly find optimal places for their pieces, and they're trying to target each other pawn structures. And it looked like it was basically going to be a draw, especially at this moment where this moment where before Gukesh sacked his knight, or even after, frankly, where both sides would queen and just give checks. But again, Magnus finds a way to win, even in the draws positions, by basically has both sides queen. Things do get spicy, so this is for you all, even at this level, at the highest level, games can turn around at dead draw positions in classical chess. So this is why you always keep fighting and trying to find chances. And yeah, I hope you enjoyed this game, and Gukesh and Magnus will be playing again in Norway Chess 2025 later down the road, so keep an eye out for that. So that's it for today's video. If you enjoyed it, please leave a like, and if you want to stay tuned for more, subscribe, and see you next time. Bye.